The ocean depths of Cray have been a breeding ground for malice energy and necromancy. With the unification of Megalennica and Zoo, more and more knowledge about magic and science have found its way to these depths. This gave rise to a new power where one necromancer twisted the pure magic into something more sinister. Mysterious Rain Spiritualist Zorga is the origin of the new twisted magic, Alchemagic, which allows Zorga to alter the rules of nature itself. This, together with his tendency to command the souls of past sailors, makes him the enemy of the natural order. This supernatural power is seen through his Alchemagic ability, which allows him to fuse two orders together to get double the value of a single order ability. Not only does this allow Zorga to use multiple order effects in a single turn, it also allows him to get double the value of a single order, because you can use them first from hand and then the second time from the drop zone itself. His Alchemagic ability will be the center focal point of his entire strategy, as you will try to capitalize on this effect every single turn to either build an entire board out of nothing or to empower the units already present onto the battlefield. But in the case you miss your important units, you can rely on his Spirit Reanimation, as that allows him, for the cost of a single counterblast, to get any unit from the drop zone onto the field. And this is the perfect way to start his combos, either by creating the perfect board or by setting up for his Alchemagic plays. In order to understand Zorga's true power, we have to take a look at the different orders which can be used with his Alchemagic ability. Probably the strongest order of them all, which will be used for all your offensive plays, is the Grade 3 order Grief, Despair, and Rejection. This is effectively a Persona right in a order card. It allows you to get the most value out of your free attacks, as Zorga is a free attack deck, so you want to make sure that every single attack hits for hard numbers and forces multiple cards from your opponent's hand. And this card allows you to achieve that. The second most played order for Zorga is the Grade 1 normal order Spiritual Body Condensation. This is the same effect as Zorga's Spirit Reanimation, only this time it's in the form of an order and only costs soul. And it does give extra 5k power to the unit. This can be great in combination with Grief, Despair, Rejection, as you can put a unit onto the board before you give the 10k power to the field. But this card can also be utilized in the early game if you have the correct pieces and you want to be a bit more aggressive. Now, so far it can be pretty hard to build an entire board with only one resurrection skill in one order and one resurrection skill with Zorga. But to build a board out of nothing, we can rely on the Grade 3 normal order Cursed Souls Squirming in Agony. This is a great way to just repopulate the board out of nothing, but it is a risky card because not only will it cost a lot of soul, but the cost will be determined by the top 4 of your deck. So if the top 4 are mainly triggers or order cards, you will be very limited in what you can achieve out of this card. But if you see 2 good targets, this can be an amazing setup card, as not only will it help you to flood the board, but it also fills out the drop zone with even more order cards very nicely for your follow-up Alchemagic turns. Another card that allows us to flood the board but gives us even more utility option is the brand new Grade 3 normal order Regurgitation from the Underworld. This gives us some nice control options for Zorga, as it allows us to clear some units from our opponent's side of the field, which then can be translated to extra pluses on our board. It's a relatively more costly card than most orders, but because it has that extra flexibility, this can be a great card for the right scenarios. But you need to be very mindful of your drop zone, because you need to have the right graded units in your drop zone to actually capitalize on this card at all times. So it will demand you to play maybe certain cards you wouldn't otherwise play, just to make sure that this card will be live at full capacity at almost every scenario. And then the final order card that's going to be very important for Zorga is the Grade 2 normal order Nectar of Sensationalism. This is a great way to put even more power onto the board, but also crit pressure on your attacks. Zorga is a free attack deck, so you want to make sure that every single attack matters, and besides just raw power and potentially guard restrict, the other best way that you can achieve that is by putting crits on those attacks. So this can be a great way for a late game push, where suddenly a unit can get an additional 20, 25, maybe even 30k power with another extra cheeky crit. Now, of course, Zorga also needs actual units to play with, and one of the most important support cards for Zorga is the Grade 2 Inheritance Maiden Hendrina. This card that only helps us to mill the deck for just setting up our drop zone with multiple orders for Alchemagic plays or potential resurrection targets, but it's also very important that it allows us to negate the Soul Blast cost, as a lot of the orders that we play that are very pivotal for our strategy uses Soul. We have Spiritual Body Condensation, Cursed Souls, as well as Regurgitation that utilize Soul to some capacity. And especially with Agony, you want to make sure that you can negate the Soul Blast cost, because paying 2 Soul is effectively your entire Soul that's going to be wasted for a single effect. And you can even go for a full Resurrection turn, as you can combine Condensation with Agony, but those costs will then completely be negated if we use it in Hendrina before activating that Alchemagic play. Another great card that allows us to do the same thing, but then for Counterblast, is Rogue Headhunter. Sadly, unlike Hendrina, it doesn't negate the entire Counterblast cost, but one Counterblast can be enough, as most of our orders just cost only 1 Counterblast. And it can also be a nice number on the board because it gains an additional 5k power, and resurrecting this with Zorga's Resurrection skill effectively turns Zorga's Counterblast cost into a Counterblast neutral, as we will get that Counterblast back the moment that we utilize a Counterblast type order. And then the final card that I want to highlight for Zorga is the brand new grade 2 guard restricted attacker in the likes of Fleet Swallower. This is a great card that can be a nice beater as a 15k beater that makes good magic numbers, but more importantly, it has the Battle Dory guard restrict the moment that we enter our Alchemagic turns. And although that might sound not that impressive, as we are already going to attack with high columns because we want to push those numbers as high as possible, but there are actual scenarios where this can come up. If our opponent has perfect guards or overtriggers in hand, they can no longer get the full value out of those cards when they're facing this particular unit, because they have to waste 2 cards from hand to even guard it. So a 1 card guard with the overtrigger doesn't work, and if they only have 2 cards left in hand, which both happens to be the new PGs, they cannot use that effect to just play it without a discard cost, because they still need to waste another card from hand to even guard the attack in the first place. So this can be a great finisher in those scenarios where it looks to be that you cannot even kill them in the first place. The ride line that you want to use in Zorga, surprise surprise, is the Zorga ride line. There isn't really a good alternative, because within Stoicheia we only have the Magnolia ride line, but it doesn't really do anything for our strategy, as the entire Zorga deck relies on a good filled drop zone and consistent access to our order cards. And the Zorga ride line does provide that really effectively. As we take a look at Rancor Chain, this allows us to draw 2 additional cards in the early game for just 1 soul, and then we have to discard a card, but we ideally just discard a order card, because that will set up our Alchemagic plays later down the line. And even if we do not see an order, by drawing into those additional cards, it will allow us to dig faster through your deck to get to those orders in the first place, as we're going to need them the moment that we hit our grade 3 turn. And then for the grade 2, with Terra's Dragon, this allows us to fetch that order that we discard with Rancor Chain back to our hand, making Rancor Chain effectively a Soul Blast 1 draw 2 cards. But at the same time, these cards also synergize nicely with the right deck itself, because you can discard orders for your right deck and then fetch one of those order cards back with Husk Dragon to your hand, and now you already have another order thanks to Rancor Chain discard in the drop zone set up for your grade 3 turns with Alchemagic plays with Zorga himself. So as you can see, these ride lines are ideal for your early game consistency, as it draws multiple cards very fast, it sets up your drop zone quite nicely, and then the moment you hit your grade 3 turns, you should be relatively all set and go to start swinging with 3 big numbers right at the gate. The triggers for Zorga are relatively flexible, but there is one thing that I highly recommend not playing, and those are the draw triggers themselves. Crits, fronts, are pretty good in this deck, but the draws are kind of risky because you're already going to mill multiple cards, you're going to draw into a lot of cards, and running draws can effectively be very dangerous with the fact that deck out is a thing. And on top of that, draws have a lot less shield value, and you already are running a significant amount of orders with no shield value, then also losing that inherent shield value of the crits and fronts can be even more detrimental for just guarding potential. So I would personally recommend a trigger line that looks a bit like 4 heals, 8 crits, 3 of the new fronts, and then the over trigger. Now of course you can also opt to run 4 of the new fronts, as it basically doesn't really affect it all too much. If you like the front trigger and the extra 5k shield, it's definitely a thing that you can choose to opt to go for. Now for this particular spotlight, I want to present two different lists for Zorga. One is a relatively generic build, that's what you're gonna see most of the time, and another one introduces a special package where it allows Zorga to do some recycle plays. But first off, let's take a look at the more generic type of build that you can play with Zorga. So as we can see here, we have all the generic cards that we already discussed. We have the Zorga right line, and our order lineup runs, of course, the Grief, Despair, Rejection, the Spiritual Condensation, the Agonies, and even the Nectar of Sensationalism and the one-off Regurgitation of the Underworld. But as you already can see in this list, the amount of actual units is relatively low, because you can already write up the PGs, and that means we only have 3 of the Zorgas, 4 of the Hendrinas, 4 of the Headhunters, 1 of the Sharks, and then 1 copy of a new grade 3 that we haven't talked about, which is Hydrolic Ram Dragon. Now the reason why I haven't disclosed this in the key units is because this isn't necessarily a key unit, this is mainly a tech option. And this is an 18k beater that's going to be active the moment that we use Alchemagic at least once, as that will fulfill the condition for this card. The reason why we play this in this particular list is because of Regurgitation of the Underworld. I want to make sure that I can use that skill at full capacity at almost every scenario. So if I have to retire a grade 3 from my opponent's side of the field, I want to make sure that I'm able to get 2 grade 3s from the drop onto the field. And with only Zorga as potential grade 3 targets, that might not be consistent enough. So I want to run at least 1 extra grade 3, and I want to make sure that that grade 3 will hit a bigger number than what Zorga could do, as that's just a 13k beater. Overall, besides that, this card will hit the same magic number as Husk Dragon, as well as the Shark, because we don't have a 10k booster. But at the very least, if I put a trigger behind it, because sometimes we have to need to call a trigger with Curse Soul of Agony, it does make a better magic number than those grade 2s. Now overall, this deck plays out relatively simple. You want to use your Hendrinas to mill out your deck, at least to a certain degree that you have enough cards in the drop to work with, and then you want to also use the Hendrina and the Headhunters to negate the cost of your Alchemagic cards. Now utilize Zorga's Resurrection skill to its full capacity, because you can use it to resurrect an Hendrina or a Headhunter before you're going to resolve your Alchemagic effect, because that allows you to then negate those costs even if you do not have those cards in your hand. And you might think to yourself, this deck doesn't have enough consistent beaters because we only have the grade 3 Ram and the Shark, and then the grade 1s are basically boosters. The reason why it will work is because we have always access to at least 1 offensive rearguard, because we can Soul Blast a Tier Husk Dragon with 1 of our Soul Blasting cost, and then that card can be resurrected every single turn for a good solid rearguard beater. That means we only need to find 1 more grade 2 that can be offensively, or maybe a grade 3, and you're already set for the entire game. Now in terms of combination plays, you can use Grief, Despair, Rejection with either Agony or with Condensation, depending on how full your board is. Regurgitation of the Underworld is mainly here as a removal option, because if your opponent has a specific card that you want to get rid of, maybe a Leonard, maybe something in Bastion, like an Elden or something, this is the card that you want to rely on in those scenarios. And then for our finishing options, we have Nectar of Sensationalism. Now don't be afraid to use it more aggressively in the mid game, because if you have it in your hand and you already have a relatively filled board, just go ahead and use it, because it goes to the drop zone, and then you can use it again from the drop zone in a late game scenario if you want to capitalize on the crit. And then finally, don't forget to use your Shark as a really good finishing option. Its guard restricted most scenarios won't really do much, but in the late game where PGs and overtriggers are going to be very important, it can win games. And because of that, you want to make sure you're going to save your soul as much as possible, because this is the soul cost that you cannot negate, unlike the order cards with Hendrina. Now as said, this isn't the only list that I want to showcase you guys, because there is a free card combo which allows Zorga to cycle through its cards while also putting big numbers on the board. So let's take a look at a different list that then utilizes this free card package. So as you can see here, the list is relatively similar, but we see a small change in our order lineup, as well as the loss of Hydrolic Ram. But in place of those, we see 2 copies of Coffin Shooter, we see a copy of Sleeping Tugging Belle, and we see a single copy of Overcoming the Unnatural Death. Those are the 3 cards that are changing this list quite a bit. First off, let's take a look at Coffin Shooter. So this is a card that, just like the Shark, uses our soul a bit, but allows us to call itself from the drop to the field for binding 1 of our orders. This is great in a scenario where we don't have an order that resurrects the board, and we still want to create at least some presence on the field. This is a card that can resurrect itself in the drop zone, so if it's there, you are already set for life. And it actually binding your orders is something we want to capitalize on, because it allows us to utilize Sleeve Tugging Belle more effectively. Because if that card enters the field, we can send all our cards from the bind zone back to the drop, and then it gains an additional 5k power for every card sent this way. Which means this can be a massive booster or attacker in the right circumstances. Yes, with the Alchemagic mechanic, you can only put one order in the bind zone per turn. But thanks to Coffin Shooter, we can potentially increase that number by 2 to 3 each and every single turn. But we have another way to make our plays even more consistent, and that's where the final one-off order card comes into play, which is the Grade 1 order overcoming the Unnatural Death, and this is another way where it allows us to cycle through our orders. Sleeve Tugging Belle allows us to put those orders from the bind back into the drop, which are then good targets for the Alchemagic play. But in order to keep Alchemagic in the first place, we also need to have these orders in our hand. This is where this order comes into play, because it allows us to get those orders from the drop back into our hand, which then sets up for future Alchemagic plays. But on top of that, this card actually also accelerates our bind strategy, because if we use this in combination with our Alchemagic play, it not only will bind the card from the drop zone for the Alchemagic action, but also the card that's going to be played from hand. So that's an additional card in our bind zone that will set up for our Sleeve Tugging Belle. So as you can see, these three cards together not only give us more field presence, but it also allows us to cycle and recycle our order card from bind zone to drop to our hand, which gives us more consistent access to our full power Alchemagic plays. But besides the inclusion of those cards, the list is relatively similar and it plays out relatively similar. You just have access to 2 cards that can resurrect themselves to the field, so you have more consistent field presence, although they will be weaker as attackers, but having at least attackers on the board is going to be much more valuable than strong attackers that aren't even on the board. And we have the options to get specific order cards back for Alchemagic plays, to use certain order cards way more often than we are usually able to in a normal Zorga list. This isn't, however, the only things that we can do with Zorga, because Zorga is a drop zone deck with the Alchemagic mechanic, makes it a very flexible and versatile strategy where you can try a lot of different cards and different strategies. And there are 2 cards, and more specifically 2 order cards, that I want to address, which you can experiment with to try out different strategies. One of those cards being the Grade 2 Blitz Order Ghost Chase. Now, most of the things, and especially Alchemagic, works with normal orders, but some of the cards, like the right line, just states order cards, so they can still interact with blitz orders. And Ghost Chase itself is a very powerful defensive tool, which not only gives us the option to reuse on place effects, but it also allows us to get cards from the drop zone back into our hand. So we can call triggers, perfect guards, or the over trigger from the drop to the field, and then bounce it back next turn during our opponent's turn with Ghost Chase, and then loading up with more defensive options. It can even get a persona right target if we resurrect another copy of Zorga to the field. And then the second card that I want to highlight is the Grade 0 Normal Order Wild Intelligence. Now, this might strike you as odd, because this is a Magnolia support card, but it has some surprising uses for Zorga as well. This allows us to resurrect a card for a counterblast, and that is basically similar to Zorga's effect. But we do lose a card in the process, so unlike Zorga, it's not a direct plus. But the thing here is that this card does mill 3 cards to our drop zone, and that means it sets up for future Alchemagic plays or future resurrect targets. And unlike Spearing Maiden Ilinia, which also allows us to resurrect a card, but it then has 2 cards on the board, this card allows us to be more flexible, because in the early game we might not have any good resurrect targets in the first place, making Ilinia relatively weak or underwhelming. Whereas with Wild Intelligence, being able to mill 3 cards, it opens up the option that there's going to be a good card just added to the drop zone, which then immediately can be resurrected with Wild Intelligence. So this card allows Zorga to be a bit more aggressive in the early game, even in a scenario where your opening hand isn't that ideal. Whereas in the case with Ilinia, if your opening hand isn't that ideal, the best thing you can resurrect on turn 2 for an offensive push is your Grade 1 right target, and that's going to be a 13k at most, unless we can use a order card as well. And that's the deck spotlight for Zorga. Now, as already stated in this video, Zorga is a very unique deck, as it uses the drop zone as a toolbox, which opens up the deck for a lot of different applications as well as approaches, because you can run a lot of tech choices or 1-ups or 2-ups, which allows it also to use different engines, as it can use those engines on a more consistent basis. Now there's one particular thing that I touched upon this video but haven't really delved into all too much, and that's of course the inclusion as a tech option, the Wild Intelligence Order card. Now, if you're interested in that particular card and why it actually works and why it's really good, then I highly recommend you guys to check out Outer Orange, her video on Zorga, because she is the one that popularized the idea of using Wild Intelligence in Zorga for a more early aggression rush play, which then allows you to win games much faster and also make the late game more consistent. She does a way better job than I ever could by explaining how the deck works and how that card is actually an integral piece to the engine. So if you're interested in more Zorga information and want to learn more about Zorga, then I highly recommend you guys to check out Outer Orange, her video about this deck spotlight. But that said, I'm also curious what you guys think of Zorga in particular, as well as this deck spotlight. So let me know all your thoughts and opinions in the comment section down below. As always, this video has been brought to you by our lovely patrons over patreon.com/FreakinInsider. You guys are amazing. If you do want to support the channel or everything that's happening on the channel, you can simply go to patreon.com/FreakinInsider and become a patron today. But with that said, I've been Mr. Time Leap, and I see you guys in the next one!